My name is Michelle Dumas-Kuehler. I'm one of the managing directors of the legal division at the Commission on Human Rights and Opportunities. Today, you'll be receiving a training under the new changes to the statute understanding domestic violence and the new protections included in those statutes.
Hi there, I'm Linda Blosey. I'll also be joining Michelle for this training. I am the Director of Training and Prevention for the Connecticut Coalition Against Domestic Violence, and I'll be talking a lot today about the whole issue of domestic violence.
Hello, I'm Tanya Hughes. I'm the Executive Director at the Commission on Human Rights and Opportunities. I've been with our agency for 29 years as we are responsible for eliminating discrimination through the enforcement of anti-discrimination laws.
Hello, everyone. My name is Cheryl Sharp, and I am the Deputy Director and Commission Attorney at the Connecticut Commission on Human Rights. We are so excited to add an additional protected class under our law. Victims of domestic violence will now be protected under the civil rights statutes in Connecticut. The law, which was enacted on October 1st, 2022, requires the CHRO and the Connecticut Coalition Against Domestic Violence to create an online training for all state employees, and so we are embarking to do so.
We believe that the legislation that we are introducing with this training will enhance the lives of all those who are affected by domestic violence. Thank you for joining us.
Hi, my name is Megan Scanlon. I am the CEO at the Connecticut Coalition Against Domestic Violence. Thank you all for taking the time to learn more about domestic violence today. It is a preventable public health crisis, and we all have a role to play to decrease domestic violence in our communities and keep each other safe. From this training, it is our hope that you will be confident in your ability to be a resource of support to your coworkers or employees experiencing abuse at home. Together, we can ensure that no one needs to live in fear.
So let's get started. First and foremost, what is domestic violence? Domestic violence is a pattern of coercive and controlling behavior that may occur between intimate partners or family members. The behavior may be physically abusive, sexually abusive, or coercive in nature. Oftentimes, leaving victims feeling scared, dependent, trapped, confused, and insecure. In Connecticut, if you assault, if you threaten, if you harass, you strangle, or stalk your partner, that is a crime. Now, you'll notice in the first slide, we bolded the word pattern. And while I wouldn't want anybody to think that if they weren't hit, pushed, slapped, or shoved, that wouldn't constitute domestic violence, because it would. What we find is that when we speak with victims and talk about their circumstances, oftentimes there is an entire backstory to the violence that they're experiencing. So you'll notice on the first slide that I talked about domestic violence as being a pattern of behaviors, not just what is a single or isolated instance. Domestic violence is very fluid. It includes both positive and negative behaviors. And what happens more often, which complicates the situation, is that when people come and they talk to us about the violence that they experience, whether it's through our services here at CCADV or whether as a trusted coworker, employer, employee, most oftentimes people do describe it as single incidents. But when we delve further into it, we find more often than not, there have been other experiences that the victim themselves might not necessarily define as abusive. And I did say that events include both positive and negative behaviors. So when we query people who are experiencing domestic violence, most often when they talk about the inception of their relationship, they'll talk about it just like any other normal couple would. They talk about their partner being very caring, very loving, very attentive. And then at some point during the relationship, it starts to escalate. It starts to go from a little bit of abuse, a little bit of criticism, things of that nature, and then it'll turn into full-blown abuse, oftentimes before it's recognized. And the challenge oftentimes for people who are experiencing domestic violence is that they're holding out hope to see these positive behaviors that they've once seen. And so that's a lot of reasons why they oftentimes remain in that relationship as well. Now, when we talk about domestic violence, there are several methods of control that their abusive partners will use to gain control over them. First is physical, the second is sexual. And then we lump the next three under coercive controlling behaviors. These behaviors at times are not criminal, although there may be some that we see that rise to that level. And those behaviors generally are emotional or psychological, technical in nature, or financially abusive, with the victim oftentimes not having access to funds. I'm going to go a little bit over each one of these methods of control and talk about the behaviors that we may see when somebody is exerting control in any of these areas. First, we're going to talk a little bit about physical violence. When we're talking about physical violence, we're talking about such things as hitting, pushing, shoving, slapping, punching, holding somebody, restraining them, inflicting bruises or welting, branding them, physically dragging them, biting them, and all of the behaviors that most oftentimes we think about when we think about domestic violence. Now, you'll notice I didn't mention one here, choking and strangling. And the reason that I leave that one separately is because if you strangle your partner, and most people will refer to it as choking, what you'll find is that that is a very intimate crime, and it is its own separate crime, strangulation. But more often than not, when we see situations in which victims identify that they've been choked, and more often than not, that's the terminology that they use, we know here at CCADV that that is a very, very high risk behavior, high risk to the victim themselves. In our world, we have what we call the 3 S's. And oftentimes I say, if you don't remember anything, remember the 3 S's. The 3 S's are stalking, strangulation, and separation. And when I talk about separation, I'm talking about attempting to leave the relationship. The reason that these 3 are so serious is because if a person is strangled, if a person is being stalked, or they're attempting to leave their relationship, this is the time in which they are at most risk for increased violence up to and including lethality. So if you have somebody that indicates to you that they've been strangled, I think it's important to let them know that that is a very, very serious situation, highest amongst all of the types of control, all of the domestic violence behaviors that we see for, as I mentioned to you before, an increase in violence and including lethality as well. So let's move on and we'll talk about sexual violence. So sexual violence, most people think about it as coercing a victim to engage in sex against their will, also known as rape. But it can also be forcing a victim to watch pornographic movies, to engage in pornographic movies. It can also be demanding sexual photos, sexting, also known as sexting. It can be using date rape drugs, roofies, alcohol, or drugs to comply somebody into having sex with them. It can also be sabotaging somebody's birth control, also known as reproductive coercion, to keep them in the relationship. And lastly, it's also having a known sexually transmitted infection and engaging in sex in a way that would possibly infect the partner as well. And some of the reasoning behind this is because if their partner has a sexually transmitted infection as well, the likelihood for them to engage with another individual after they leave the relationship, if they do, is going to be less attractive. So that individual is going to be less attractive if they have a sexually transmitted infection. Now we're going to move over to the behaviors that we would consider constitute coercion or coercive control. Those start out with emotional or psychological abuse, and generally this is the entry point into domestic violence abuse. And oftentimes, like I said, these are behaviors that are negated or rationalized by a victim in the beginning stages of the domestic violence relationship, oftentimes because the victim themselves has never seen these behaviors. So oftentimes these behaviors will get rationalized by saying such things as, well, my partner had too much to drink, and so that's why they did this, or they're under a lot of stress. And so we see these beginning behaviors as humiliation, criticizing, insulting, belittling your partner, ignoring or dismissing them, invading their privacy, intimidating them, blaming them, and punishing them. And then it can also rise to such things as extreme jealousy and possessiveness. And I'm not talking about your garden variety jealousy that most people experience. I'm more talking about that overall jealousy and possessiveness, jealousy of not just family members and anybody that could be attached to the victim themselves. Then we start to see things escalate a little bit by invading somebody's privacy, setting rigid guidelines within the relationship or within the home, threats to family members or pets. And then a big factor in domestic violence is isolation. It's really important for that abusive partner to figure out ways to isolate that victim. And so what you'll see is that the partner will isolate them from friends and family. What they will also do is sometimes geographically isolate them so that they don't have any access because there are not friends or family that are living close by that can offer support. The next abuse that we see is technological abuse. And I believe that technological abuse in one way, shape, or form lays on top of all of the other types of abuse, whether it be sexual abuse, physical abuse, psychological, or financial abuse. When I talk about technological abuse, what I'm talking about is such things, and this is very important, as non-consensual tracking. So that abusive partner will want to know 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, where that victim is. And in order to do that, they use such things as personal trackers, GPS devices. And nowadays, I believe it's important when I'm speaking with a victim to determine who is the owner of their cell phone. And by that, what I'm talking about is not necessarily the physical cell phone itself, but who is the owner of the cell phone plan. And the reason for that is because oftentimes the person who owns the plan has additional perks. So they're able to go on to their portal, whether they have Verizon or Sprint, whatever cell service they have, and they can see who the victim has been calling, who the victim has been texting. And while they won't be able to see exactly what's on those texts or the discussions that were had, they will get a pretty good idea of who that individual has been communicating with. In addition to the fact that they can see who they've been communicating with, they can also see where that cell phone is at any time. So sometimes we see people put GPS devices in cars. Sometimes it's just a matter of going on to a plan portal and trying to locate where that victim is by using the portal as well. So it will be demanding check-ins, monitoring people's communications. You will see excessive texting, excessive phone calling, and oftentimes excessive emailing as well. So all of these things are what we consider to be technological abuse. And lastly, we're going to talk about financial abuse. When we speak about financial abuse, what we're talking about there is withholding money. And oftentimes we'll see things on the opposite end. So, for example, we'll see a relationship in which the victim is forced to go out to work and then surrender their paycheck to their abusive partner. And then on the other side of that spectrum could be an abusive partner who does not allow or forbids their partner to work, keeping them in control in that way and dependent upon the abusive partner. So we see withholding money. Oftentimes we see denying access to bank accounts, ATM, credit cards, or limiting a budget for that victim. We'll also see, like I mentioned to you before, the victim having to surrender their paycheck and also ruining a victim's credit. If that escalates, oftentimes what we'll see is an abusive partner who will show up or call the victim's workplace incessantly. They'll hang around the parking lot waiting for that victim. Oftentimes, they'll also insist that the victim be driven to work. And when I see situations like this, more oftentimes than not, it's not necessarily during the time that that victim has to be at work. So say, for example, they work 9 to 5. It can be at the whim of the abusive partner. And whenever that partner decides to drive the victim to work or decides to, whenever they want to pick them up as well. And then, of course, it can also be forcing the victim to pay for everything. In other words, saying things like, if you want to communicate with me, then you'll have to buy me a cell phone. Or if you want to talk to me, you'll have to take me out to dinner. Now, I mentioned here a little bit about the workplace and employment financial abuse in the employment arena, but I also think that it's important to understand that it's not just the employment arena that I'm talking about when I talk about financial abuse or potential financial abuse. I can also be talking about education as well, because I've seen several situations in which a victim's attempt to become further educated is jeopardized. And the reason that that happens is because if a victim goes back to school or goes to a certificate program or wherever they go to try to further their education, what that can do for them is it can create a situation in which that victim now can be economically stable. And with that stability, it'll give them the opportunity to leave the relationship. And the abusive partner, knowing this, will thwart all of their attempts to get that further education as well. So I've gone over all of the methods of control, and I'm going to move on. I'm going to talk a little bit about the warning signs of domestic violence. So when we think about the warning signs, oftentimes what we see or what we hear is that people who are being abused may come in, they may talk about accidents, they may show some injuries. So you may see some visible injuries. And when you ask them about it, what they'll do is they'll say that they're clumsy, they're stupid, they fell, they tripped, they're accident prone. They also may frequently miss work, school, or social occasions without any explanation. So oftentimes, if a victim is being abused, especially physically, and there's marks, they may call out sick because they don't want their colleagues, their bosses, their coworkers to see that they are that they have these physical bruises. Oftentimes, they'll also seem afraid or anxious to please their partner. They'll go along with everything their partner says and does. And they will be forced to check in often with their partner to report where they are and what they're doing. So it wouldn't be uncommon for a victim who arrives on the work scene, then to have to contact their partner to let them know that they're there and that they've started their workday. They also may receive either at work or on their individual cell phones frequent harassing phone calls from their partner, which really, when we start to talk about some of these warning signs and some of these methods of control, we can see how it might interrupt that victim's day-to-day activities at the workplace. And I'm going to talk a little bit further about that. Now, for some people, leaving is not necessarily an option right away. And one of the most common questions that we get is, quote unquote, why does she stay? So when we query victims and talk to them about their relationships, more oftentimes, this is what a victim will say to us. They don't necessarily want the relationship to end. They do, but they do want the violence to stop. So let's look at the issue of staying versus leaving, and why do some victims remain in the relationship? So I think it's important to understand that for each and every single person who has to make a decision about their relationship, it is unique. So if I was in an abusive situation and you were in an abusive situation, the reason that I may leave is very different than the reason that you may leave, or the reason that you stay in the relationship is very different than the way that I've chosen to stay in the relationship. But in general, what we find is that most victims will remain in the relationship if leaving the relationship will make their lives or their children's lives worse. Because as I note on the bottom of this slide here, when a victim remains in the relationship, so do the children. And even if a victim leaves, the children are more than likely to have some contact with the abusive partner if they're the biological parent of that child. So just because you leave a relationship does not necessarily mean that you won't have to have contact with that abusive partner when there's children present in the relationship. In addition, oftentimes victims will remain in the relationship if they have no real option or resources to leave. If you remember before, I talked about isolation, friends and family having no support systems. So if there's no support systems, if there's no family, if there's no income, oftentimes the victim will remain in the relationship. Lastly, if there's enough positives in the relationship to make it work, then they will stay in the relationship. So sometimes what will happen is people weigh the pros and cons of staying in the relationship, especially for people who I guess I would say have limited resources, don't have access, aren't even aware of the resources that we offer at CCADV. They may make a decision to stay in the relationship. Now, an important thing that I do want to say about staying versus leaving is I look at it in kind of three different areas. Number one, it could be that a victim chooses to stay in the relationship. They're going to try to get through it, work it out. They're going to increase their safety factors, and that's an individual choice. And then we have people who choose to leave the relationship. So they have the resources, they'll gather the resources, they'll move on. And then we have that middle ground of people who really have no resources, no economics to help them leave, so they don't have the financial stability to be able to leave. And then they don't have friends and family in the neighborhood or people that can support them. So they don't necessarily choose to stay. Because of their circumstances, they're forced to stay in the relationship. So I want to make sure that we're distinguishing between people who choose to stay in the relationship and then people who are forced to remain in the relationship because of their personal circumstances. So we also have to, I think it's really important when we're talking about leaving versus staying, it's important to think about what that individual is going through. It's important for us to kind of think through it and put ourselves in their shoes. I often talk to people when I'm doing training and ask them, even if you're in a healthy relationship and you decide that your relationship isn't working for you any longer. Like, as I said, there's no violence in the relationship. It's just perhaps you've grown apart, perhaps things aren't working out for you, and you make a decision that you're going to leave the relationship. It's not necessarily something that you can do immediately, i.e., you can't wake up in the morning and say, oh, I think I'm going to leave this relationship, and then have everything at that moment right in place for you so that you can leave. Oftentimes it takes careful planning, and so if you imagine what it would take for you to leave a relationship, domestic violence or no domestic violence, more oftentimes not, think about, once you're thinking about everything that you need to get into place to leave that relationship, now add domestic violence on top of that, and you can see the challenges for people. So most people, like I said, whether they decide to remain or leave the relationship, it really is a formal decision. And this is very fluid. So if I'm working with a victim who on Tuesday decides that they're going to stay in the relationship, we're going to provide them with some safety outlets and some safety planning, and we're working through that, doesn't necessarily mean that a month from that Tuesday, that individual victim doesn't make a different decision and says, I'm going to start working at trying to leave the relationship. So for some people, it's very formal and they say, yes, I'm going to do this. And for some, it's very informal because coping with the current situation is more favorable for them because there's no better options. So they might be a person who, like I mentioned before, is kind of stuck in that middle section where they may want to leave, but they're forced to stay until they can get everything in place. And for most victims, they cope with the bad and they really hope for the better. They kind of live with what the status quo is. They make decisions on an ongoing basis. And all along the way, they're still attempting to do what they can do to make their lives for themselves and their children's better. So I think it's important to understand that, you know, if a victim makes a decision to leave the relationship, it is not necessarily one that is easily made. Now, why is that? Because there are challenges to leaving. You'll see here we have the graphic with the abusive partner, the victim, and the survivor, and they're all very much intertwined. So what are some of those challenges to leaving that relationship when somebody makes that decision? Number one could be fear. As I mentioned to you before, especially if people are needing to remain in contact because of the fact that there's children in the relationship, doesn't necessarily guarantee for that individual that if they leave that relationship, that the violence won't continue or the contact won't continue. We like to think that once an individual leaves the relationship, the violence is now gone and they'll never have to face any of those situations. But like I said, keeping in mind that oftentimes there's children, there's other factors that continue to attach those two people together. When we talk about fear, of course, we're talking about fear of future violence, but we're also talking about the fear of the unknown. So for many individuals, not knowing what's out there, being concerned about whether they can make it out on their own is a huge fear factor. And for some people, they're more afraid of what they don't know than what they do know. So you may see people say, well, at least temporarily, I know what's going on. I can predict when the violence may occur, and I can do something to keep myself safer. Whereas if I leave the relationship, I'm not going to know where that abusive partner is. I'm not going to be able to see what happens before the violence escalates. I'm not going to be able to predict it because I won't see the individual. And for that reason, I may be in more danger. So there's a big fear factor. And of course, you know, there's children involved. The victim does love that partner. They may not like their behavior when they're abusive, but for some people deep down, they truly love that individual. And then we get into those factors about helping somebody to maintain a single, household if they leave the relationship. Do they have enough money? Do they have a support system? So oftentimes that isolation, that limited or no support system can keep them in the relationship. And then Oftentimes, we also see that the abusive partner, seeing that their partner may be making a decision that they want to leave the relationship, so that will prompt the abusive partner to promise to change. Now, I always hold out hope that an abusive partner will change, but when we're working with victims, I think it's important to recognize that the promise to change oftentimes may be the lure back into the relationship. And so when I'm working with somebody, I oftentimes suggest that they see, even though the abusive partner has promised to change, see if they actually make any changes. Because as I mentioned to you before, it's the lure of the promise that gets people back into the relationship. It's not necessarily the actual change. And then for some people, until they can gather everything that they need to leave the relationship, oftentimes it's just safer for them to stay at that time. Now I'm going to switch gears and I'm going to talk a little bit about domestic violence in the workplace, because this is where you may see people coming that have been victimized. They may be colleagues, they may be coworkers. So when people who are experiencing domestic violence come to work, it does impact the workplace. You know, we've conducted numerous studies, and we found that experiencing domestic violence in the home can result in impaired job performance and excessive absenteeism. So I'm going to quote, I'm not big on statistics, but I'm just going to quote a couple of statistics so you can see the impact of domestic violence in the workplace. We find that about 87% of victims receiving harassing phone calls at work. We see approximately 96% of female victims report that the domestic violence affected their ability to perform their jobs, while 60% reported that they lost their jobs due to the abuse. And then more than 50% of individuals who have been stalked, they report that they're being stalked at work. So if you remember when I talked about the financial abuse, I talked about such things as having to respond to excessive phone calls, having the abusive partner show up at work, or hang around the parking lot to wait for that victim to finish up work. So you see that it is pretty significant. There's no statistic here that says only 1% of victims receive harassing phone calls. It's, close to 90% of them that experience that. Now, when somebody comes into work and they're experiencing domestic violence, it's important to understand that it's not just impacting the victim themselves, but it impacts those around them. In addition to, the multiple negative consequences for victims and survivors, it can also spill over to the workplace by compromising the safety of both victims and their co-workers. And I also think what happens is, especially when people are working in teams, it could jeopardize the flow of work as well. So as a coworker, I think it's important to understand what the options are in helping somebody to access help, so that you can be a resource in the event that somebody confides in you. And so later on during this presentation, we're going to talk about what resources are out there. I think as a supervisor, if you're supervising an employee that's experiencing domestic violence, there really is an important role for you to ensure a victim's safety, to help them maintain their job security. And then over in general, as an employer, it's just good practice to be a part of a positive response to domestic violence. And we're fortunate here in Connecticut that we have a lot of businesses and companies who really are supportive of their coworkers, their employees, if they're experiencing domestic violence. Now, when we talk about work productivity, these are maybe some of the things that we're going to be witness to. We may see a change in the victim's working patterns. We may see frequent absence, tardiness, or requests to leave work early. We may see a reduced quality and quantity of work. As I mentioned before, especially on your team, it kind of jeopardizes the workplace. But you'll see a drop in usual performance standards. We'll also see a change in the use of phone and email. We may see excessive personal calls or texts or strong reactions. So if you see a victim on the cell phone talking to somebody and they have strong reactions, that may be an indicator, or they may be avoiding calls at all nature. And then on the other side of that, because they're unsafe in the home, you may also see them spending increased number of hours at work for no apparent reason. So they're not necessarily trying to meet a deadline or get a project done, but they're staying longer and longer at work. And the reason for that is because their home is a place where that is not safe for them. And then you also may see frequent visits to the workplace by the employee's partner as well. Now, in terms of the change in behavior, you may see somebody become very anxious, very quiet, very distracted, depressed. And then on the other side, you may see them become very aggressive because I would say aggression is more like tension. They feel very tense, and so their response is a little bit more aggressive than you usually see. They may start isolating themselves from their colleagues. And when I say that, what I mean is because it may be becoming more obvious to employees, colleagues, coworkers that the violence is escalating, or we're seeing physical signs of the violence, that the victim themselves may start to isolate themselves from their colleagues. They also may be obsessed with having to leave work on time. So you remember in the beginning when we talked about the psychological aspect of domestic violence and those methods of control, one of the things that I mentioned was setting rigid guidelines for the victim, setting rigid guidelines for the household. And so they may be obsessed with having to leave work on time because there is a certain expectation that they be home at exactly 4:30, say, hustle to maintain those rigid guidelines that have been set for them. Oftentimes, they feel worried about leaving the children at home, and they may start to become very secretive about their home life as well. So, when we're talking about best practices, when in response to domestic violence, I think the first and foremost, it's really important to understand that domestic violence is not the victim's fault. If we have to lay blame on anybody, it's the person who's perpetrating the violence. So if we see a sudden change in work productivity, just understand that what happens is that the victim themselves is trying to respond to their obligations at the workplace, as well as whatever is going on within that relationship and the fear and unsafety that they internally hold. So that for some victims, the workplace is the safest place that they can possibly be. So if we consider firing that victim, what will happen is it will only increase their dependency on the abusive partner. And therefore, what happens is because they don't have the ability to leave, they don't have economic stability, it may make them stuck in that relationship. So when we're working with victims, I think it's important to express your concerns and let the employee or coworker know that you're there to listen. It's important to listen to them and believe them without judgment, because you may hear some things that you've never heard before. And then offer to connect them with all the resources that your organization, your business has, whether you have a human resources department, our services, like I said, which I'll talk about, an employee assistance program, or their local domestic violence organization. The one thing that I do want to stress, especially if you're making a referral to an employee assistance program, is I think it's important to relay to that victim that what happens within the conversations you have if you're working with an employee assistance program are confidential, because more oftentimes than not, I know that victims will feel that if they go to an employee assistance program and they start to talk about the violence that they're experiencing in their lives, somehow that information will get back to the employer. So it's important to stress the confidential nature of an employee assistance program. And I also think it's important to let that victim know that it's not just counseling services that can be provided through an EAP. They also have a host of other services that they can assist the victim with as well. So I'm always in favor of referring somebody to an employee assistance program, but I want to give it a caveat and make sure that you explain in full detail, the confidential nature of that and what that employee assistance program can do for somebody. So those are best practices. What we don't want to see is ignoring the situation and pretending that it doesn't happen, or forcing the victim to talk about it, because that's just going to lead to more insecurity, frustration, and that victim may feel as though if they talk about the violence that they're experiencing, then they're going to put their employment at jeopardy as well. It's important not to blame them or make assumptions about the situation, or to mandate or tell them what to do or place any types of conditions on support. In other words, it's important not to say, if you don't do this, then, we're going to start the disciplinary process, because that's going to only escalate the anxiety that a victim is already experiencing. So if an employee or coworker confides in you, first of all, I would try to have a confidential space. And these are the things that you can speak with them about. You can ask them whether they feel safe in the workplace. You can also ask them, if possible, if a change in their work schedule or work location is necessary to maintain their safety. And I mean, within reason, if you can do these things, it would lessen the stress and keep that victim safer. You can ask whether the physical layout of the workspace should be changed to protect them. In other words, if you're working and they have an office, can they switch offices with somebody? Can they work in a different cubicle? Ask them whether they have any type of an order of protection against the abusive partner. And if they're comfortable with giving HR or security a copy or a photo of the abusive person to share with security personnel, reception staff, or other relevant persons, maybe when that individual abusive partner appears on the work site, something can be done before they actually reach the victim. Ask them whether it's necessary to share information in order to maintain their safety. So would they want other people to know? Would they want the security staff to know that this is happening, so that they can have those additional safety measures? And then more importantly, and lastly, well, not more importantly, but lastly, do they need an escort to and from their vehicle, or can they safely enter the building? Because remember what I said, 3 S's, stalking being one of those S's. If their partner is out there stalking, then we know that there could be increased opportunity for that violence to escalate. So now, if you suspect that a victim is experiencing, if an employee is experiencing domestic violence and they don't wish to confide in me, what you can do is this. You can share information with them, including your organization's policies around domestic violence, and you can share resources with them. You can let the employee know that you care about their safety and that you're always there and available to talk. Like I said, it's important not to force that individual, But I think if you set the stage where that victim feels like they can disclose, then and that they will be safe, then you have a better chance on being able to proactively work with that victim. If they don't feel like they disclose, then what will happen is those situations can escalate, and then, putting a victim in a very precarious situation. So I also say, it's important to always protect a victim's information. So if you even develop a safety plan around work with that individual, just share it with the people that only need to know. If there's an employee's information on your website, you may temporarily have to remove that employee's information. Of course, organizationally, what you want to do is you want to develop protocols for responding to abuse at work, whether that abuse is via phone, fax, email, or in person. So when we talk about domestic violence, some of the responses, and I mentioned to you before, is that work may be the only safe place. Make sure that you have non-discriminatory and non-retaliatory policies and procedures. Make sure that you have leave and other reasonable accommodations and assistance. And then to the best ability and, to the extent that's allowable by the law, make sure that you try to protect that individual's confidentiality as much as possible.
As I indicated earlier, there's been a change to the statute as of October 1st, 2022, that allows for domestic violence to be a protected class in Connecticut. Now we're going to discuss what the legal protections are in Connecticut as it relates to the discrimination laws, domestic violence, and in general discrimination laws associated with the protected classes, and ways that people can file complaints with the Commission on Human Rights and Opportunities. As of October 1st, 2022, the status as a victim of domestic violence is now protected as discrimination in Connecticut. That protection extends to employment discrimination, housing discrimination, public accommodations, and credit transactions. So domestic violence protections in the employment realm. What it means is that there are protections as it's relating to the termination or failure to hire somebody who is a victim of domestic violence, holding that person to different standards. As discussed earlier by Linda, there may be some situations where accommodations are going to be necessary as it relates to timekeeping, when people sign in and sign out, their performance, their interactions with their coworkers in terms of how they are interacting and the differences that may occur. There is going to have to be an awareness that somebody who is a victim of domestic violence may need some added protections. They may need some added counseling in terms of what they are experiencing and how that relates to the work environment and to their colleagues. Part of the new protection that went through on October 1st is reasonably accommodating victims of domestic violence who may need those accommodations in order to assist them in their personal life. Now, denying a reasonable accommodation could be seen as a violation of the statute when it's requested by the person who is seeking this reasonable accommodation because of the domestic violence status. So what could that possibly mean in terms of what is a reasonable accommodation for somebody who is a victim of domestic violence? It could be that they need to seek medical or some other professional help for injuries that they've received. It could also mean that if they are seeking services to help with their safety and protect the safety of their family, that may take some time away from work, and that may be something that needs to be accommodated, access to that time in order to secure for them the safety measures that they need to put into their personal lives, but will affect the time they can be at work. It may be that they need some counseling, again, medical type counseling that is associated with time away from work, especially in circumstances where maybe that person does not have a lot of extra time or none at all to use. The accommodation may be that the person will receive time, even if it's unpaid. It may be that actions by the employer need to be taken in order to provide safety for the person at work. That could include just additional security for purposes of making sure, or actually alerting security for purposes of making sure that the person is safe. It may be that they have to change the location of where they're working in order to allow for the person to not feel that their abuser can show up at their work location and see where they are. It also may be that the victim of domestic violence needs to acquire legal services and they need time away in order to obtain those services and potentially go to court and or other legal proceedings in order to remove the abuser from their lives. So domestic violence as it relates to housing situations. If a person who is a victim of domestic violence finds that they are not either able to rent a unit and or buy or sell a unit because of the knowledge of the person who has the unit of the domestic violence situation that they are in, that would be a violation of the statute. Having additional rent charged either prior to the beginning of the tenancy or while in the tenancy as a reaction to the domestic violence situation that the tenant is in. Any additional fees, rents, terms or conditions would potentially be a violation of the statute based on the person's inclusion in that protected class. And then refusing to make accommodations. Just like at work, there may be situations where the landlord is going to have to provide some extra measures as it relates to safety and safety concerns, access to the property. Even if there are a number of police calls to the unit or noise from the unit because of the interactions between the victim of domestic violence and their abuser. Those are certainly circumstances where a landlord is going to have to be aware and they're going to have to be accommodating because of the person's inclusion in victim of a domestic violence status. So the victim of domestic violence may ask the landlord to give advance notice of when contractors are coming into their apartment to make repairs. And that could be just for safety purposes if the person has engaged in legal protections. And it could be just for notice purposes to secure the unit. Again, refusing to rent or participating in court proceedings associated with domestic violence. Often landlords are going to conduct a background check to see whether the tenant has any sort of a legal history of, and so it may be that that comes up in their background check. That's something that the landlord is going to have to look into and potentially accommodate if it's related to the protected class that they're in. And certainly, and probably most frequently may be that the tenant would be evicted because of the noise and or activity in their unit and or the police calls to the unit that may occur. Again, the landlord is going to have to be aware of this going on and also make accommodations if necessary if it's related to the domestic violence. And in places of public accommodation, a victim of domestic violence should not be precluded from getting services or being allowed into places because of their inclusion in this protected class. Unequal services due to potential conduct of the abuser in public locations should not be a reason that the victim themselves are denied service in these public places. Also, the places of public accommodation should not make any assumptions as to what is happening with the person who is being abused. That is, again, a discussion that will need to happen between the place of public accommodation and the person who is the victim of domestic violence. Negative assumptions about parenting, especially in school situations, or even in police situations where there could be the knowledge that this is going on, again, is going to be a violation of the statute. There are other employment protections associated with victim of domestic violence. Those are found under Connecticut General Statute 31-51 SS. So if an employee is a victim of family violence, the employer shall, which means must, provide the following: paid leave or unpaid leave in order to seek medical care, obtain services, relocate the family, and or participate in civil or criminal proceedings against or including themselves and the person who is abusing them. An employer can limit that leave to 12 days during the calendar year, but it's important that employers very much familiarize with this section of the statute, so they make sure that they're affording the victim of domestic violence all of the protections they are guaranteed under the statute. If a victim of domestic violence needs to file a complaint, they should do so in one of the regional offices of the Commission on Human Rights and Opportunities. Those offices and their locations in which towns they serve are all located on the CHRO's website, which is www.ct.gov/CHRO. Our regional offices are located in Hartford, Bridgeport, Waterbury, and Norwich. And those offices take complaints related to employment and public accommodation discrimination. We also have a separate housing unit. That unit's located in Hartford too. They're a statewide unit, so regardless of where you're located in the state of Connecticut, that is the place to file a complaint if you have a housing discrimination complaint. If your complaint is taken by an office that is not the geographic location of your office, we will make sure to get it to the right office. But if you do need to know which office you need to file in, please go to our website where we will show you all of the towns and which offices they are associated with. There are many protected classes under the law, including victim of domestic violence, which came into effect this last October 1st of 2022. It's often that people come to file complaints with the commission and they will file under several different protected classes. That's why it's important to familiarize yourself with these protected classes in order to know that there are likely other protected classes this person may fall under. I'm not going to go through all of them right now because there are many, but please keep in mind that it's likely that there may be other protected classes the person may also fall under. And it's important as an employer and as a housing provider that you're aware of all the protected classes should a complaint be filed.
So thank you, Michelle, for all of that information. And now I'm going to talk about resources in Connecticut for assisting a victim of domestic violence. In Connecticut, we are a two-pronged system made up of Safe Connect and our 18 domestic violence organizations. The point of entry into services, unless that individual has already made contact with one of their local member programs, is through Safe Connect. The beauty about Safe Connect is that there are 4 different ways in which you can contact them. You can contact them via telephone at 888-774-2900. You can also text that line. If you go to our website at ctsafeconnect.org, you'll find a pop-up chat box in which you can chat with a certified domestic violence advocacy coordinator. And then lastly, you can always email us at safeconnect@ctcadv.org. When a person contacts us at Safe Connect, what we will find is that the advocacy coordinators are there to gather some information about that individual. They will lay out a variety of options, and then they will move forward with that individual to try to determine what is the best option for that person. So some people may only need information and referrals. Some people may need more extensive services that may be such things as counseling or emergency housing. So the advocacy coordinator at that particular point in time will really take a look at the overall situation. And if you remember in the beginning of the training, I talked about domestic violence as being a pattern of controlling behavior. The advocacy coordinators will really try to get a history of the domestic violence that that person is experiencing, them, triage them to the best available support systems. If that individual is in need of additional support services, then they would move on to one of our 18 domestic violence programs. And you can see by the map that we have located on the left of this screen, in every single city and town in the state of Connecticut, there is a domestic violence organization who is responsible for the provision of services. We have 18 domestic violence programs. They're primarily located in urban centers. And then we have 2 that are located in the northwest corner and the northeast corner, which serve more of a rural population. If that individual is in need of such services, here are the services that they provide through the member programs. They provide counseling services, they provide support groups, they provide emergency shelter, they provide court advocacy, safety planning, children's programming, lethality assessment, information and referrals, and they also each have persons or departments that can provide education and training on a local level. So regardless of whether you're seeking the services through Safe Connect or you're working with a member program, each and every time that you meet with someone along the way, it's important to note that they will always be doing a risk/lethality assessment to really determine how at risk an individual victim is at, and they'll also do safety planning as well. And by safety planning, what I mean is determining what can keep that person safe at this particular immediate time, also coupled with planning for the future. Thank you.